The condemned man sat in his cell, staring at the ground. Anxiety coursed through him, nerves knotted in the pit of his stomach. Every faint sound from the hallway outside snapped his head to the door. Each time, he feared his moment had arrived. And then, it happened. He heard the clang of metal on metal, a key sliding into the lock. The door of his cell swung open. This was it. Salvador Puig-Antich was about to endure one of the most cruel and agonizing deaths in history. Execution by garrote. But this isn't the medieval ages, this is Spain in 1974. So join us on today's episode of The Infographic Show as we take a closer look at the gruesome story of Salvador Puig-Antich and one of the most cruel deaths in history, the garrote. Born on May 30th, 1948 in Barcelona, Salvador Puig-Antich was destined to make waves in Spain's political landscape. In his early years as an activist, he joined the Workers' Commissions, which would grow to become one of the largest trade unions in Spain. But this was only the beginning. Salvador would soon align with the Movimiento Ibérico de Liberación, or MIL, the Iberian Liberation Movement, a radical left-wing Catalan group infamous for their daring urban guerrilla strikes between 1971 and 1973. The group orchestrated a series of armed bank robberies which they referred to as expropriations. The aim of these daring raids was to secure funding for their bold retaliations against Spain's oppressive government. During the time Spain was under the governance and military dictator General Francisco Franco y Bahamonde. Between 1939 and 1978, Franco ruled over the country as the head of the state, after overthrowing the Second Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. His regime was largely influenced by fascism, especially when it came to how labor workers were treated, as well as installing a single-party system. And that's why Salvador joined up with the Iberian Liberation Movement. They were fiercely opposed to the Francoist regime, and their bank robberies weren't acts of greed but rather a lifeline for Spain's struggling working class. But everything changed on September 25, 1973. During one of those heists, Salvador and his fellow MIL members found themselves in a standoff with the Spanish police. Chaos erupted as gunfire filled the air. By the time the smoke had cleared, a police officer lay dead. Salvador, accused of firing the fatal shots, was captured and swiftly blamed for the killing, though he had fired only 2 of the 5 bullets. The Franco regime was hungry to take retribution against Salvador, especially because of his political leanings, painting him as the perpetrator. As a result, the Puig-Antich case was passed on to the hands of a military court. Normally, such a case would have fallen under the jurisdiction of a criminal court, but this was no ordinary time in Spain. The Franco regime had its reasons for bypassing due process. Only a month earlier, on the 20th of December 1973, one of the most prominent figures within the Francoist dictatorship had been assassinated. Admiral General Luis Carrero Blanco was a close confidant of Francisco Franco, serving both as the dictator's right-hand man, but also the Prime Minister of Spain. He would hold the position for around 6 months before being killed. Carrero Blanco had been attending daily mass at the San Francisco de Borja church on Calle de Serrano. After leaving the church, he returned to his car, a Spanish Dodge 3700, only for a street-side bomb to detonate, killing the Franco-appointed head of state. Of course, the attack had nothing to do with Salvador Puig-Antich, or even the Iberian Liberation Movement for that matter. The assassination was the work of ETA, a Basque nationalist separatist group with a complex and controversial history. Founded in the Basque Country between France and Spain, ETA began as a peaceful movement dedicated to preserving the traditions and the culture of the Basque people. However, over time, ETA became a more violent paramilitary group in response to the Francoist regime, and conducted a campaign of bombings and assassinations throughout Spain, one of which killed Carrero Blanco and enraged the regime. Since the attack on Carrero Blanco, the regime was looking to punish dissidents with the most extreme measures possible. Salvador Puig-Antich might not have had any involvement in the death of Admiral General Carrero Blanco, but the response to the assassination by the Francoist regime did not bode well for the imprisoned man. Capital punishment was nothing new for Francoist Spain. It had been restored by a decree of the Francoist regime back in 1938, and between 1940 and 1975, 165 judicial executions were carried out. This included the execution of Luis Companys, president of the Generalitat of Catalonia. Over Franco's years in power, his regime was consolidated and capital punishment became less commonplace. Between 1950 and 1959, 58 people were executed by garrote and 9 by firing squad. During the 1960s, executions under Franco's regime became increasingly rare, with only 6 carried out during the entire decade. These were spread sporadically, with 2 occurring in 1960, 63, and 66, respectively. There had previously been a 6-year-long suspension of executions due to widespread criticisms of the regime. However, this ended in 1972. A man named Pedro Martinez Exposito was sentenced to death for homicide and robbery, although he was shot by firing squad, not garroted. When it came to review Salvador Antique's case, the Franco regime left nothing to chance. The Captain General of Catalonia, appointed directly by Franco, called for a panel of resolute captains to form a military tribunal. Their role, however, was not to decide Salvador's fate. That decision would go far higher. What followed was a torturous delay, as the case made its way through a number of ministers and councils, each one passing judgment upward. After weeks of agonizing uncertainty, the final decision rested in the hands of Spain's dictator himself, General Franco. It was a move designed to ensure that Salvador's punishment would serve as a direct message from the regime's highest authority. The military court handed down Salvador's sentence on January 9, 1974. They had ruled in favor of the death penalty. Neither Salvador nor his family had any illusions that this was a ruling that could be repealed. Shortly thereafter, he was incarcerated within the Barcelona Men's Penitentiary Center, more widely known as La Model, and the situation only got worse for Salvador once he was imprisoned. Welcome to the 5th gallery of La Model Prison, cell 443, the room where Salvador would spend most of what remained of his time on this earth. It was late in the evening, sometime after 9 o'clock, that Salvador was informed of the latest news about his sentencing. Word from the Council of Ministers that had been presiding over his case was passed into the condemned man. In the presence of Oriol Arau, the lawyer who had represented Salvador, he had been sentenced to be executed by the Francoist regime. The impact on Salvador was clear to see. How else are you supposed to react when somebody tells you you're going to die? Salvador Puig Antique wasn't the only man scheduled to die that day. In Tarragona, another execution was planned for a man who called himself Heinz Shea, claiming to be Polish and from Chechen. Like Salvador, he stood accused of killing a police officer. But Heinz Shea was really George Michael Welzel. He hailed from Cottbus in East Germany. He was due to be executed in Tarragona on the same day that Salvador was to be put to death in Barcelona. Welzel was by many accounts just a common criminal, but having the executions occur simultaneously was viewed as an intentional move on the part of the Francoist regime. Allegedly, they were to be held on the same day in order to deliberately confuse public sentiments around the execution, downplaying the fact that the regime was killing a political activist like Salvador. It certainly seemed like they wanted to equate a common murderer with someone who politically opposed the regime. There was no denying the growing scope and the strength of the movements, like the Iberian Liberation Movement. The Franco-controlled government could hardly feign ignorance to the public support for militants that opposed them. Fearing that the Iberian Liberation Movement might mobilize or that public pressure could force their hand, the Francoist government chose a far more drastic solution: silence Salvador before his story could spark a larger resistance. Franco and his regime likely hoped that Salvador Puig Antique's death would serve as a warning to the people of Spain. Any defiance against the dictatorship would be met with unflinching brutality and merciless retribution. Somehow, things still managed to get worse for Salvador. He would die the next morning. Shortly after the now devastated Salvador received word of what was to happen to him, a press conference was held to declare what the Council of Ministers had ruled. Pío Cabanillas, the Minister of Information and Tourism at the time, was expected to report much earlier in the evening, but his address to the press was delayed. This was considered highly unusual, and it wasn't until almost 10 o'clock that same night that he revealed Salvador's fate to the public. According to the law under the Franco regime, a prisoner had to be given exactly 12 hours between the notification of their sentence and their execution. Having given Salvador the fateful news at around 9 p.m. that night, he was set to be killed by 9 o'clock the following morning. Arau, Salvador's lawyer, immediately got in contact with the man's family, calling up his sisters, Montserrat, Ima, and Carme. They were told to come to the prison immediately. His youngest sibling, Mersona, didn't join them. She was asked to stay at home, tending after her father. He had been in poor health, and he was so fragile that Mersona couldn't even tell him what was to happen to Salvador until much later. Salvador's sisters reached out to their older brother Joaquim, who was living in the United States at the time. A future renowned psychiatrist, Joaquim would later gain prestige in his field, but in that moment, he was simply a brother racing against time to see Salvador one last time. Tragically, the clock ran out. Joaquim arrived in Barcelona too late, the horrific execution already carried out. That night, Salvador Puig Antique sat and talked with his sisters and his lawyer from a waiting cell in La Modelo prison. This no doubt agonizing wait period was often referred to as being in the chapel among the fellow prisoners at La Modelo. Throughout what would become some of his final conversations with his family, the young man, who had been a fierce anti-Francoist activist, was calm. He maintained his composure, and even if he might have internally wanted to break down and cry, he didn't. Perhaps he'd just come to find some morbid sense of acceptance, knowing that no matter how unjust the ruling was and how barbaric his fate, that becoming distraught wouldn't offer him or his family any solace. He might have even thought that it would be too satisfying for the likes of Franco and the military court that had sentenced Salvador to death. So instead, he did his best to not allow his spirits to dampen. That's not to say that he spent the entirety of his final hours somber or even stone-faced and emotionless. He was still able to enjoy some moments of light humor thanks to the company of Montserrat, Ima, and Carme. At one point in the night, someone, presumably the lawyer Oriol Arrau or possibly one of Salvador's sisters, broached the topic of preparations for his death. He was offered a chance to speak with the resident priest of La Modelo prison. However, Salvador declined. When he was asked if there was someone else he'd prefer to confer with, he gave the name of a religious man from the town of Montaro in Catalonia. The man was Salesian, part of a Roman Catholic religious group that emphasized works of charity and providing education, especially to the poor, allowing some boys a path into priesthood. The Salesian man was contacted, making his way immediately to the prison. He had previously been Salvador's teacher, and after presenting himself to the prison staff, he was permitted to take Salvador's side during his dwindling hours. But while this was happening inside cell 443 of La Modelo, there was a frantic effort going on outside of the prison's walls. Despite there being barely enough time, a group of lawyers put out numerous calls to try their best to get the ruling for Salvador's execution appealed, or at the very least postponed. They were battling not just against the clock, but against the Francoist government themselves, and yet a great effort was made to save Salvador's life. There were several attempts made to reach the Minister of Education, Ruiz Jimenez, in order to make contact with Willy Brandt, who was the Chancellor of Germany at the time. What could the Chancellor of another country hope to offer? Well, the intention was likely to stir up international support for Salvador's case, which could be leveraged into pressure against the Francoist regime to revoke the execution sentence. There was, after all, a precedent for this. Only a few years prior, in 1970, the Burgos show trials had seen 16 members of ETA. Much like Salvador, 2 of the ETA's members had been involved in the murder of a police officer, and a military tribunal handed out a death sentence to 6 of the defendants. This move sparked so much international outrage and sympathy for those condemned ETA members that the Franco regime commuted these sentences to lengthy 30-year prison terms. Knowing the regime had previously yielded to pressure and halted executions, Salvador's lawyers launched a desperate, far-reaching effort to save his life. With time running out, they scrambled to uncover any legal or political strategy that could force the Francoist government to back down once again and prevent Salvador's death. But time simply wasn't on their side. If it had been earlier in the day, there might have been more that the lawyers could do to prevent Salvador's death. But the fact that the ruling was delivered so late could very well have been an intentional, calculated move by the Franco regime. Delivering the ruling to Salvador so late in the evening would mean that any possibility of saving him was lessened, almost ensuring that the execution could go ahead the following morning. Had his lawyer known the verdict and been able to warn Salvador much earlier, then there could have been time to implement a more effective strategy. Instead, the night scattershot calls were the man's best hope, and hope was running out rapidly. The rest of the night passed, with Salvador likely getting what little sleep he could, despite undoubtedly feeling tense about what horrors the morning would bring. Among them was a scare at around 8 o'clock the morning of the execution. For a moment, Salvador's nerves were seemingly being tested, when it appeared that the execution might have been moved forward without warning. Fortunately, it was little more than a false alarm. It was still to go ahead at the allotted time, and the executioner had already arrived at the Barcelona Men's Penitentiary Center. The executioner arrived from the city of Badajoz and immediately got to work, starting to install the macabre apparatus in the prison that would be used to kill Salvador. Like many executions via garroting, Salvador would sit on a small wooden seat, a tall pole looming behind him. This pole was the mechanism that would tighten the ligature, ensuring a slow and excruciating death. It's not known what exactly the one used on Salvador was made of. A garrote could be performed with chains, ropes, wire, or even fishing line, anything that would successfully strangle a person. Outside the prison, Spain's police forces had assembled in overwhelming numbers, ready for any resistance. It was feared the Iberian Liberation Movement or outraged members of the public might try to intervene, but the authorities were determined to ensure Salvador's execution proceeded without disruption. Meanwhile, Salvador was able to maintain a glimmer of hope on the day he was due to die. Thanks to his lawyer, he was aware that there had been a widespread and intense movement to save him, one that had reached people at the highest levels of governance. While he wasn't aware of the full details or whether or not the lawyer's efforts had been successful, he spent the morning in the cautious optimism of the possibility his death may yet be averted. But those attempts to save him, no matter how intense or far-reaching, had simply been made too late. Shortly after 9 o'clock, Salvador's sisters, his Salesian former teacher, and his lawyer were forced to leave his side by prison guards, and Salvador was placed in handcuffs. No one else was permitted to be present at his execution. It was at this moment that the reality set in. There was no way out of this. His hope was lost. Salvador was brought to the seat prepared for his execution, his wrists and ankles bound to prevent him from moving. It was time. The first turn would have been enough to steal Salvador's breath, as the ligature cruelly bit into his throat. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the cruel device did its work, subjecting him to long, agonizing minutes of suffering before the end finally came. Salvador was just 25 years old when he was executed. Shortly after, his body would be taken to a cemetery in Montjuic. The following day, a funeral was held, and his family buried a brother and a son. For many far left-wing Catalans, especially Catalan autonomists, supporters of independence, and anarchists, Salvador Puig-Antich's death was symbolic. It was an act of retribution by the Francoist regime against their region's fight for an independent government. In the wake of the execution, some of the biggest factories in Barcelona shut down when thousands of workers went on strike in solidarity with Salvador, with hundreds even being arrested as a result. University students throughout Barcelona and Madrid also staged demonstrations in protest of the execution and ended up fighting with police. In their attempt to make an example of Salvador Puig-Antich, the regime unwittingly created a martyr. Rather than silencing dissent, his execution galvanized support for the anti-Franco movement, breathing new life into resistance efforts. His legacy became a rallying cry for those who dreamed of a free Spain. In 2013, Salvador's family appealed to the Spanish Supreme Court to review the execution, but the effort was declined. An Argentine court adopted the case under universal jurisdiction, but as of February 2024, exactly 50 years after Salvador's death, his family are still seeking justice for his execution. What are your thoughts on the use of the garrote? Was it a cruel tool of oppression or a reflection of the brutal justice systems of the time? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out the most brutal death in history, Gollum's Cave, or click on this video instead.